Quite possibly the exact polar opposite of Cannibal Holocaust, 1968's The Wild Wild World of Jayne Mansfield is a Mondo film that seems to be running in the opposite direction to most of the genre. The Mondo genre, for those unfamiliar, were a series of movies that were arguably the most popular in the late 60s through to the early side of the mid 80s. They were basically sensationalised documentaries that tried to come across with an air of authority, but were ultimately quite broadly fictional and largely relied on stereotypes, gore and shock to get people into theatres. An example of the genre would likely be something like Shocking Asia, a Mondo faux documentary that's disguising itself as a laid-bare look at Asian culture, while really using the time to play on Asian stereotypes and show cultural practices out of context, and in some cases either completely making up practices that were never even performed, or recreating practices that hadn't been done in decades if not centuries. The emphasis was on shock over the information, but it kind of satiated two things to a willing audience. It gave them blood, guts, gore and the exotic for their bloodlust, and it gave them a sense of superiority that, whatever country they were in, generally either Europe or the US, at least they weren't doing such savagery. And then you have movies like The Wild Wild World of Jayne Mansfield, which is basically an ultra-campy cash-in attempting to capitalise on Mansfield's name being in the papers after her death in an automobile accident in 1967. Basically, Jayne was originally signed on to make a movie called Jayne Mansfield Reports on Europe, and in 1964 she travelled to Rome and Paris for a few weeks, with the plan being to finish off the film with some US locations as part of an us and them type contrasting piece, with the main focus being on showing the world what a wild world Jayne Mansfield lived in. Then Jayne Mansfield died in 1967 before the film was finished, so they had to go and do some reshoots to pad the movie out, and they even went as far as to get a sound-alike to fill in for her narration portions that she hadn't yet finished. Now, before we get started, I need to make it clear that I had heard of Jayne Mansfield before. I may have even seen a movie or two that she was in. But I had no idea who Jayne Mansfield actually was beyond a name and a possible film poster credit before I went into this thing. For a more modern audience, what I did with this movie would be a bit like watching the direct-to-VHS cash-in Hang In With Leo without having any idea who Leonardo DiCaprio was, barring recognising his name and vaguely recalling seeing it in the credits of Critters 3. That's the level of familiarity I had with her heading in. And I think that worked perfectly, all things considered. Seriously, I'm going to spoil this thing from here on in, so if you just want a quick thought summary, I thought it was hilariously cheesy and strange. I enjoyed it, and I recommend you go and hit it up if you can find it. So, as mentioned, the film's a 90-minute travelogue following Jayne around various US and European locations, just being Jayne. She's an almost Monroe-esque figure, but with a much more cheeky and naughty edge. But she still has a warmth and charisma that's very infectious. In Italy, she reports on the Spanish Steps and the Trevi Fountain. She talks about Italian men and the pastime as old as time of them harassing women by pinching their arses and leching at them with binoculars while they change clothes. She talks about the sex work in Italy and how Italian sex workers will almost always want to haggle for a price to do the deed. She then wisely informs us that the average session with an Italian prostitute will cost you about $3, and that she would never work so cheap. Which, just, wow, okay. She then heads to Cannes and the Riviera, where she simultaneously slags off the paparazzi as being nasty, vile people who'll do anything for a photo, while also utterly throwing herself at them while modelling bikinis. This section's introduced as Jayne's been invited to attend the Cannes Film Festival. We never see any of the actual festival itself though, so boo! After that it's over to Paris and we get to see Jayne have a luxury pampering session. She rather crudely explores the world of the Parisian trans nightlife scene and explores the LGBTQ community in rather blunt detail. She visits the Champs-Élysées, the Eiffel Tower, and a couple of underground erotic strip and art shows. My personal highlight being a frankly insane sequence where we get to drop into the annual Best Breasts in Europe competition, where boobs from different nations are presented to judges via what can only be described as a titty window. And then it's back to the US, where the film changes tact slightly, I assume because this is where the majority of the reshoots had to happen, and due to what was and wasn't allowed to take place in the US during this time. As the film shifts tone, angling away from the Europeans are mature and handle nudity as an art form side of things, into the those gosh darn Americans sure do love their titties, as we spend an ungodly amount of time basically doing the whole "ah shucks America" thing, featuring topless ice cream vans and the many strip club restaurants of LA, followed up by more boobs and a trans beauty contest in New York. Seriously, the first 2/3 of this thing feel almost like some kind of Eurotrash travel log, and then the last 30 minutes or so, barring a jaunt to an, at the time, illegal trans beauty contest, which I will say looked like great fun, it just turns into look at all these boobs up until the final 10 minutes, which is just kind of odd. But the weirdest part of this whole thing, or at least the sleaziest part of this whole thing, has got to be the final 10 minutes, because, well, the whole documentary aspect goes out of the window, and instead the film goes full tonal whiplash, changing things up from a 20-something lady having a lark around Europe in the campest way imaginable, to a 10-minute eulogy of her life, complete with an abstract recreation of the car crash that killed her, photos from the accident scene, including photos of her dead dog, multiple shots of her children with narration basically saying things like, "Her children were used to living in a mansion with warmth and love. It's a much emptier experience these days. The state will decide their fate in time." With the film ending with extensive coverage of a mansion and narration explaining just how much of a tragedy and how well loved Jayne was. It's honestly the most jarring thing I've ever seen in a movie, and I was left with my jaw firmly on the floor. Nonetheless, a cheeky but whimsical time is guaranteed for all if you pack your bags, grab your binoculars, and join Jayne for a romp around Europe in the frankly ludicrous adventures that make up the wild, wild world of Jayne Mansfield. And I've got to say, I really grooved with this thing. While it's absolutely antiquated for its time, somehow managing to come off as both transphobic, homophobic, and misogynistic, while also seeming really sincere and quite progressive for the time, I really got on with the tone and vibe this thing gave off. While a lot of the film is clearly scripted, from the narrations through to the various stunts and escapades that Jayne gets up to while on tour, there isn't really much in the way of an actual script to speak of, so I'll have to talk about this a bit more loosely than my usual standard. What I can say for it is it's a rather zippy affair. It has clear act markers to help time the film out. While the transitions between the acts are a little on the clunky side, I thought the first two acts did what they set out to do pretty well, and I really enjoyed just seeing Jayne clearly starting to be done with her holidaying experience, where everywhere she went she was plagued by photographers and perverts, while the narration over the top is sickly sweet and overly charming, clearly not following what we're seeing. It's a very light, bubbly, and totally camp experience, and with this pretty much being my first known exposure to Mansfield as a personality, I can absolutely see that this was a clear influence to both John Waters and Divine in shaping their movies and personas. It's almost uncanny, honestly. They clearly took what she did here and twisted it to their own needs, and I think that's just wonderful, honestly. What I will say is, for me, things did start to come a little unstuck at the tail end of the second act. Basically just as Jayne's leaving Paris and getting ready to fly back to the US. Everything seems to slow down quite a bit from that point onwards. We get a bit of repetition, another visit to a trans hotspot but on US soil this time, and some strippers that feel same old at this point. And by about 20 minutes off the end, I did start to drift a little bit as I tried to figure out where the film was going. To me, if I'm speculating, it felt a bit like Jayne was supposed to visit another location or two in Europe to finish the film off, but couldn't be asked to deal with perverts and weirdos anymore, so she compromised and came back to LA to film a few bits to tie the movie off. Because the film feels a bit lopsided with the US footage, and it doesn't really add anything other than a lot more boobs. Boobs aren't so much the problem though with this film, as, you know, that's what people come to see. What is a problem is that last 10 minutes, which tonally jars with the entire rest of the movie, absolutely doesn't suit the tone or vibe for the rest of the film, which was otherwise really light and campy, and just came across as sleazy and exploitational in the worst possible ways. As a lover of exploitation cinema, even I thought it was a bit of a low move, and I'm still trying to process my exact feelings on whether it stops the film from well and truly going to the next level, or if it's the thing that cemented this fairly harmless romp in my mind as something much more noteworthy. I find it poor taste to try and sell someone's death for profit, and particularly when the filmmakers have involved the subject's actual kids. I mean, say what you will about the Bruceploitation subgenre, it was distasteful, but they rarely got super intimate and prying. I don't know, on that aspect I may need to do some soul searching, but if you've already seen this thing, I'd be interested on hearing your thoughts. Due to how long this film was in production, it's unsurprising that there were a lot of kooks involved in making this metaphysical broth. In terms of the people who wrote the narration dialogue and came up with the scenarios for Jayne, we have Charles Ross. He has 6 writing credits and a career spanning from around 1965 to late 1971. There's nothing particularly massive of note, but this comes from around the midpoint of his career as a writer. On the direction front, we have Charles Brown Jr., Joel Holt and Arthur Knight. There's not a huge lot to say about them either. Charles has 1 directing credit, this film, and he also worked as an exec producer on the movie. He passed away on May 4th, 2001. Joel has 4 directing credits, this was his last foray into directing, and he was really more of an actor, with 11 credits under his belt in that field. Again, nothing much to write home about. And finally, Arthur Knight, who was a rather eccentric film historian and had a regular column in Playboy magazine as a film critic. He has 3 directing credits to his name, and this was also his last one. He sadly passed away on the 25th of July 1991. It should be noted that almost all the people involved in this movie were either professionals who worked in the adult industry, or at minimum were people who had experience with some form of erotic or explicit content. Which I think goes a long way to explaining quite how this film ended up the way it did. As for the quality of the direction, well, it's not too great. The fact the film was shot over 4 years, over 3 directors, with ideas for how the film should take shape drastically changing from location to location, this feels very much like a cobbled together production that feels quite panicked and very much like everyone involved just kind of figured shoot first, work it out later. There's no real sense of any kind of stylization or, well, direction to this thing. The entire personality, vibe and charm of this production lies solely on the personality of Jayne Mansfield and a delivery of the narration over the runtime, with the only concession to that being the quite cheap and cheerful but otherwise rather charming opening titles, which use papercraft stop-motion animation that really fits the vibe of this thing quite wonderfully. Cast direction is almost non-existent too. Obviously they framed shots up for some of the nightclub scenes, but outside of getting Jayne to sit at tables and occasionally do minimal actions, such as a scene where she pretends to try and climb over a fence to get a better look at the gladiator statues, there isn't really a whole lot of intricate physicality or instruction. Quite literally, the majority of this film is made up either of B-roll of famous European landmarks or stock footage from old movies, some of which Jayne starred in and some of which she didn't. This also bleeds over to the Cine, which is really flat profile, doesn't really try to say or do anything too crazy, and is largely shot handheld. While they do manage to capture some lovely scenery and a few oddities here and there, there's no coherency and vision here on what's been shot versus the end product. This isn't helped by the fact that the film nowadays is incredibly washed out and suffering from a lot of print damage, which only really diminishes the location footage even further. It honestly just feels like the film was built from scraps, in a rush to try and cash in on a person's death. It's arguably the most entertainingly cheesy attempt at doing it that I've seen, but the over-reliance on B-roll, the shonky sequence building from an edited perspective, the total lack of stylistic choice or coherent colour use, it really just shows this film up for what it is, a very enjoyable but ultimately rather seedy cash grab. There's only one performer in this thing worth talking about, and that's Jayne herself. And honestly, I laughed my way through this thing with ease. She gives the impression of being a shy and retreating girl in a narration, but they intercut that with footage of her stripping off on a boat or posing nude for Playboy. Quite honestly, if how she was in the movie was how she was in real life, I could easily see how she became so popular with Hollywood's finest at the time, as she seems like a real hoot. But while she's warm and charismatic in this, I absolutely cannot say it's a good performance by standard measures. She's ultra cheesy and entertaining in an MST3K way at its core here. So if you like that kind of vibe, I'd say you'd have a winner here. And finally, the soundtrack. It's 90% light bubblegum pop sounding scoring, married up to some very rare, for lack of a better word, eccentric comedy sounding music with an early synthy edge. It only adds to the camp factor and really did help smooth over the cracks in this production nicely. It wasn't anything standout, but it was more than fitting. As far as I can recall, there wasn't any actual on-set audio recorded for the entirety of this thing. It's all overdubbed by Jayne, a Jayne sound-alike, and a guy at the end who announces her death. The only on-location audio I can recall hearing in this was an interview with a trans woman who was making a living by pretending to be a Jayne Mansfield lookalike. The audio was handled quite nicely in that section, and it's an absolute time capsule of the time, but it did come across as a little bit sneering to me. The Wild Wild World of Jayne Mansfield opened in theatres in 1968 and then more or less fell off the face of the earth. It was recovered by Something Weird Video in the 90s, who finally released it on DVD in 2003, unrestored as a double feature alongside The Labyrinth of Sex. Later it would finally get a partial restoration and released by Severin Films in 2020 on DVD and Blu-ray. Picture quality on the release for this is a definite step up from the Something Weird release, but it's still far from perfect, with a lot of colours heavily faded away and plenty of print damage on display. Extras include an SD VHS rip of the film on the Blu-ray edition to go alongside the 35mm scan, which was the main presentation, an interview with Blanche Barton talking about Jayne's interactions with Anton LaVey and her loose connections to the Church of Satanism, a trailer for the movie, and a bonus feature called The Wild, Weird, Wonderful Italians, which is basically the same as the main feature, but without Jayne Mansfield and with lots of Italian stereotyping. Grande. All in all, this is a low-quality, hyper-campy, absolute cheese fest that feels sleazy, hokey, and weirdly charming, all in equal measures, and I really had a blast with it. It's not something I could watch every day, but I think if I was in the right headspace, I'd have an absolute time and a half with this thing. While it does get a little too lumpy and problematic by the end, that doesn't take away from about an hour and 10 of pure glamour schlock at its best, and a very confusing but sincere introduction to the world of Jayne Mansfield. I can absolutely recommend this thing if you're into John Waters or have even a passing interest in the developing world of adult cinema from around this time.